with boredom. Have I felt boredom? Can I remember feeling boredom? But then when I try to think about the times I have experienced boredom, I suddenly realize that thinking about boredom it convinces me that I don't know what boredom actually is, that I can't, my hand just closes on empty air. Do you know of that thought experience I'm talking about?
Yeah, completely. I would argue that we're all always bored, yet most of the time we don't realize we are because we're preoccupied with other things. So when we have those moments to ourselves when we're not doing these things, boredom rises to the surface, and it kind of haunts us, it kind of nags at us, and it kind of goes, it kind of pulls at us, and we feel it. But we don't know what it is, because I believe we spend most of our time fearful of it and trying to avoid it. I think boredom is the kind of gaping void in our existence that, we're completely and utterly fearful of.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall, and this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm speaking with Lee Rourke, author of the short story collection Every Day, and more recently, the novel The Canal, which won last year's Guardian Not the Booker Prize. And it's a novel that is ostensibly based in boredom, not a boring novel, but one whose protagonist is very much concerned with boredom. And This what you've said so far about boredom, it brings to mind a lot of the discussions I've been hearing in the literary world recently, again, about boredom, because I heard some sprout up when your book came out, and I hear more sprout up now that another author, one not among the living, has put out a book about boredom. And it sounds like a continuation of the same conversation. You talk about the void. Is boredom really directly to do with looking at the bottom of existence free of distractions? I mean, is that all boredom is clearing away the detritus we build around ourselves?
I think so. I don't know if it's clearing away. I mean, for me, the writing of The Canal and the exploration of boredom within it as a fiction was a kind of response to my readings of Heidegger and his wonderful writing on boredom in his lectures, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. And he kind of breaks it down into a kind of threefold structure, which is, the first form of boredom, as he calls it, is when one becomes bored by something. So in The Canal, he's bored with his job. He leaves it. And then the second form of boredom in the Heideggerian sense is a kind of being bored with something and then being occupied by the passing of time belonging to it. So, Heidegger will illustrate this feeling as, that feeling we get. It's almost a sense of dread when we're waiting at train stations and the train isn't arriving and we're in this stasis and there's nothing we can do. Airport lounges as well, when we're waiting for something to happen and nothing happens. So that's the second kind of form of boredom. And then the third form of boredom, which for me is the pinnacle of boredom, is what Heidegger would call profound boredom, where he says it is boring for one. And there's a wonderful kind of quote from him where he kind of says he kind of calls boredom the muffling fog that strips everything to this form of indifference, and reveals being as a whole. So I kind of want to explore why there is boredom in our lives and what it is. I mean, it's inescapable, basically. It's that kind of underpinning to existence, and it's a kind of I think Beckett comes close to it when he calls it the tinnitus of existence. It's this constant ringing in our ears, and we can't get rid of it.
You've mentioned two names right away, Heidegger and Beckett, and more people will have read Beckett listening than I imagine will have read Heidegger. But if they've heard of Heidegger, if they have not read him but have heard of him, they may have heard of him as a philosopher whose works it is boring to read. And people who have not read Beckett but have heard of Beckett might think of him as a writer whose works are boring to read. You know, I don't necessarily agree with that. But what's the connection?
I think it's this exploration of being. I think Beckett strips back and he wants to get, to that essential expressing the unexpressible. This desire that wells within us from somewhere we don't know where all we can express it with is a language or a sense of rules that are limited. And this sense of failure because of it. I'm talking primarily about Beckett here. With Heidegger, it's more of a kind of metaphysical exploration of why we are and why we exist, expressed through this kind of this underpinning dread. He would say we are suspended in dread. And when we are, there's this slide into nothingness where being is revealed. Now, where I part from Heidegger would be very heroic and go, we've got to rebuild, blah, blah, blah. But I would say, no, let's exist within this nothingness. Let's explore this nothingness and kind of be happy in it. And I think that's kind of where Beckett is, but his isn't essentially an acceptance of it. His is just, he dwells, his writing and his philosophies dwell within it, and there's no way of escaping in it, and it's perpetual.
I'm imagining a reader, and I guess I'll use the sort of very tired phrase, a common reader here. And I'm imagining this reader reading Heidegger and thinking, I'm very bored reading Heidegger. And I imagine them reading Beckett. Let's say they pick up The Unnameable or what have you, and they say, I'm bored, but I'm less bored than when I read Heidegger. And now I imagine them picking up your novel, The Canal, and they're saying, wait, this is about a character who is bored, therefore I must be bored reading it. But then they realize that they're not bored. It's you deal with boredom, as those two do, and you deal with it explicitly, but you do it in a way where creating boredom in the reader is deliberately avoided?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can talk about Pale King, David Foster Wallace, where he really, I think, this isn't his book, this is an editor's version of a book he was writing, but what I've read, I finished reading it now, and, I think he really wanted us to feel boredom, to actually feel boredom reading his book, as his iterations try to illustrate. Whereas in The Canal, I wanted a character to reflect his experience of boredom, and his kind of basic level, kind of philosophical understanding of it. So, I wanted to explore boredom, and I wanted it to be a novel about boredom, but obviously I didn't want it to be a boring novel. What excites me is there seems to be now with novelists, and I think this is why people can't get to grips, modern readers can't get to grips with people like Beckett, because I think the novel now in existence is there's a default mode, and it's a kind of regurgitation, especially in Britain, of the Victorian novel, where there's, the beginning, the middle, and there's narrative arc, there's characterization. And when novelists like Beckett, and something that I try to attempt, is when you strip back those tropes, I think that can sometimes be problematic for readers, not because it doesn't work, but because it's not something they recognize. I think that's the problem why people don't like Beckett. They don't recognize it as fiction or as a novel. It jars and it doesn't quite work for them. But that was basically what he was trying to do. With The Canal, I was aware, that it's a novel, but I'm also aware, my personal belief, that novels fail. So I liked the kind of dichotomy within the novel. Everything fails within The Canal. He doesn't quite embrace boredom. He doesn't quite get the girl. He doesn't quite step back into reality. And, I think, that's what I try to reflect in a novel like The Canal, this kind of ongoing failure, but this ongoing kind of, ringing in the ears of existence, basically.
And the thing about The Canal as well is that it's one of the most realistic novels I've read in quite some time. Maybe that says a lot about the sort of books I read. But you mentioned people who read Beckett and maybe can't get on board, and why. I would also argue that they don't recognize reality in Samuel Beckett's books. They see a verbal construction, and I'm all for verbal constructions, even if they don't correspond to reality. This is something that I advocate for on this show a lot. But the canal seems so deliberately, almost harshly realistic, that I feel as if you must have had the moment where you've reviewed books in papers and such that don't adhere to this reality. You must have taken a stance sort of toward realism at some point in the writing of this novel, consciously.
For me personally, The Canal is not a work of realism. It's a complete work of theoretical construction. It's a series of composite images. And a series of fragments and fragmented iterations that kind of somehow add up to a kind of whole, which is the novel, The Canal. Obviously, I know that area of London well. Obviously, I've spent lots and lots and lots of time in that area, so a certain sense of reality has crept into the novel. But purely the construction of it was, I did not attempt to write anything realistic. It's why my characters don't have names. It's why the dialogue is more of a kind of address to the reader rather than a conversation between each other. And I was, I tried to avoid certain things in writing The Canal. On the other hand, I'm completely thrilled that people find it really, really realistic, even though my approach wasn't to write realism. I do believe in voice, and I do believe in a sense of place, so, those things are important too, but when I'm writing the novel, it certainly wasn't, I wasn't trying to be realistic.
And you have a protagonist who just seems to one day put his job behind him, put his normal existence behind him, to sit on this bench overlooking a canal all day long. And this is perhaps this is a protagonist who joins a long tradition of protagonists who opt out of normal human life, whatever that may be, for the time and the place. And that's something, it seems to me, a reader can very much can get on board with, and can think, maybe I'd want to do that. In some novels, that is the jumping off point for a complete and utter transformation into a life that is a fantasy, essentially. But here it seems like this is maybe something that could certainly happen to any one of us if we decided to stop messing with PowerPoint spreadsheets all day and just sit. It's like, this could be the outcome, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, actually, because, I've spoken to so many people who've read The Canal, and so many friends, and, that it is a fantasy of a hell of a lot of people to just get up one day from their desk and just keep walking and walk out and never go back. And for some sort of adventure or life to begin. So I was aware of that writing it, and I suppose I didn't want anything to happen. I wanted him to go to the canal and sit there and wait for things to happen. And I don't know if you've ever been to Regent's Canal or there's similar canals where you live, but for me, the Regent's Canal in London, it's a real location from the city. Even though it's just below surface level, you step down to the canal in London, and the streets are just above you. And although you can hear everything going on above you within the city, the life that he's left on the canal just below the surface, there's this almost kind of static tranquility, this toing and froing, which is signified in the canal by the coots and the swans and the Canada geese going by, and back again, and the commuters cycling and jogging on the towpath back and forth. And there's this almost kind of real meditative kind of experience down on the canal. It's a very odd place, especially the Regent's Canal in London. It's almost like an alternate kind of place to be. And so it was perfect for me to write a character who, doesn't go to work one day, but instead of, going on an adventure and going out into the city, he avoids the city and he steps down to the canal where there's these other slower things going on. And for me as a writer, it was great to try and capture that kind of slowness of time and that kind of dislocation from the city.
Would it be at all correct for me to say that the protagonist goes and sits at the canal all day, driven by boredom, and he watches an office worker in a building across the way on the other side of the canal, it seems like to me, who works on, as we said before, PowerPoint presentations and whatnot, and he watches people in this office who seem to be in their jobs because the jobs distract them from boredom. It's kind of like whichever way you're going, the boredom drives you to it. Is that anything like what you or the protagonist would believe about this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, he becomes preoccupied. At first, he sits on the bench, and at first he he stares at the graffiti around him, or he stares at his feet in the dirt and the cigarette ends in the dirt, and then he looks at the canal and he sees the Canada geese and the swans, and then on the other side of the bank is the office block. And it kind of serves as a mirror, signifying his kind of own sense of dread and repetition. And, he sees the characters in the office block and he watches them throughout the day, and he watches them walk from desk to desk, back and forth. He sees them working through a pile of invoices all day long. He notices that, they all dress similar. He notices that they all have, the same flat screen monitors, and, they all kind of are mimicking this kind of repetition of existence that they're not fully aware of. They're kind of mechanized in it. And for the protagonist of the canal, this office block, this window, which is also, it's a window into their lives, but it's also a reflection back of what he's been feeling. He sees everything and everyone as this mechanized kind of being who isn't aware of what he's feeling. They're caught they're enmeshed in modernity and society and their jobs and blah, blah, blah. And, he sees it. He sees that he's different. He sees that he's dislocated from them, and he sees that they can't see it, and for me, that's fascinating to write about, and for him, it's a kind of catapult into a real kind of embracing of his boredom. It strengthens his kind of attitude and the reasons why he's decided not to be like them.
The protagonist now, he claims to seek boredom. There are points when I believe he says he's bored, but he lives a life, at least within the pages of this book, within the span of this book, that I don't think a reader would call boring. Many exciting things happen, and he describes excitement that it visits upon him, these things that happen. And he watches these office workers who perhaps they wouldn't say they were bored, but they do seem to be fully enmeshed in boredom. Is there anybody in this novel who is not at least somewhat deluded about boredom, whether they think they're bored and they're not, or they think they're not bored and they are, or is there always that contradiction?
I think there's always that contradiction. I couldn't really write myself out of that contradiction. From what I've read and what I've felt with boredom, it's completely drenched with such contradictions. It's paradoxical, that Pascal said, the sins of mankind are caused by our inability to sit still in a room, or, Bertrand Russell said, the sins of mankind are caused by our inability to embrace boredom, no matter how hard we try to do it. So there's always a kind of schism and a kind of friction. I think everyone in the novel The Canal, that they're experiencing, some of them aren't aware, they're not consciously aware that they're bored. Some of them are aware that they're bored, but everyone is experiencing the same kind of paradox, the same kind of friction that this losing battle, as I call it in the novel, with boredom creates. And to me, that's the most exciting part of it. Most of my characters are two archetypes. It's either those who try to embrace boredom or those who try to fight it, and they're constantly rubbing up against each other with the friction that it creates. And to me, that's kind of exciting as a writer because, it can lead to endless possibilities. But within society, if I want to talk about it socio-politically, you can argue that this failure to embrace boredom, it alleviates a kind of violence within us, and it can be nefarious. It can be a physical violence. It can be an inner violence. But it creates this tension. So for me, that's a great thing to kind of write within. This tension.
And the boredom seems to lead this character, this protagonist, to get onto the verge of developing certain grand theories about boredom being, the driver of human actions, sort of like what you've just described. And he mentions, and I wrote this down specifically because it did intrigue me, he talked about the relationship between boredom and desire, and perhaps the equivalence between boredom and desire, which made me think I was dealing with perhaps an unknowingly Buddhist character. Am I?
I've got friends who will argue, that it isn't boredom that underlines everything, it's desire. People like Tom McCarthy wrote about that in his novel C. But and I kind of, for me, within the Canal, for me, there's nothing spiritual within it. For me, it's an intersection of three things: boredom, violence, and technology. And I think what I was trying to do, in Krapp's last tape, Beckett, he's fiddling with the spools, the recorder, listening to his past, and the moment of clarity in that play, surrounded by the technology and also the memories, is that moment on the boat where he felt desire. I think I tried to echo that in the Canal. He embraces boredom, and for the first time, he realizes that he's never loved. And for the first time, he realizes that, he is alive. He feels desires for people, and he desires the strange woman who sits next to him on the bench. He desires to then, start to interact with everything around them. He wants to take her to a cafe. He wants to remove himself from the Canal because desire has kind of, started to kind of drag him into a reality. So I wanted to play with that. I wanted him to start to realize that, there's other things at play, not just boredom. And, as I can argue that, and other people can argue that boredom underpins everything, there is also this desire within us as well that kind of underpins things. So I guess I was trying to create another tension within the book there.
In examining, or thinking about anyway, what the protagonist does and how he talks to me, the reader, or how he talks to the woman he encounters, I had a hard time determining for myself. So I'll just put it to you and see if you have any ideas. Is this protagonist, how smart is he? Is he smart or is he dumb? Where does he fall on that spectrum? Because I have no idea.
You know what? It's funny. I wanted him to think. I wanted it to be a voice that thinks it's clever, but isn't, expressed through a kind of simplicity of language. So I wanted it to be a voice that thinks it's on the verge of a breakthrough, but doesn't have the power or language to break through. So in my mind, he's quite a ridiculous character because, you're not going to be able to embrace boredom by just sitting still on a bench. It's just not going to happen. It's the wrong way about it. So from the very outset, he's wrong-headed. But I wanted there to be a sense of, if only he knew it, he would be on the verge of some sort of brilliance, but he can't articulate that brilliance. So at the very outset, he articulates boredom as feeling really good. He doesn't have the language skills to kind of get there. Again, it's another tension. It causes him to become more and more frustrated until he kind of abandons this kind of idea that he can embrace it at the end, and then he rests on the side of desire. And then when that's kind of curtailed, all he has is himself to look at. He looks at himself in the reflection in the canal. So, he's stupidly brilliant. That's the way I would say.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is novelist Lee Rourke, author of The Canal, which won the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize 2010, and a contributing editor he is at 3AM Magazine. If you'd like to hear our conversation again after the show is over, visit colinmarshallradio.com or go to iTunes. Go to the iTunes store specifically and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. On iTunes or on colinmarshallradio.com, you'll have the complete Marketplace of Ideas archive free for the download as much as you want, whenever you want. Want to keep up with new and upcoming Marketplace of Ideas conversations and other related internet interestingness? Sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. It's on the front page of colinmarshallradio.com's Marketplace of Ideas section. Way easier than I'm making it sound. Click the logo. On the front page, you'll find the complete and very, very simple instructions on how to sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Questions, comments, feedback of any kind, send it on to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. It's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Now back to the conversation with Lee Rourke on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. The press that has received The Canal, they've talked about it a lot as something, a book very of the moment, and something the offbeat generation that it gets called. I think the back cover copy used that phrase as well, but it's thought of, it seems to me, as a very modern, in the sense of modern right now work. And it's funny because you mentioned this character who thinks he's cleverer than he is. And it seems like there you have used something not modern, but strategically you just used something very traditional from the British comic tradition, specifically, over there, which is characters who think themselves much smarter than they actually are. Maybe this character doesn't think himself much smarter, but do you think you've pulled from tradition by doing that? Completely.
I mean, there's so much of The Canal that is really a traditional approach. I mean, yeah, that's my attempt at some sort of irony in that kind of British literary sense. The kind of the tall poppy syndrome. We don't like characters to be too clever, so we cut them down. So he kind of cuts himself down with his inability to express, which is also kind of Beckerton in that sense. But the one of the main foundations. This is what it's really odd, actually, because I never perceived it as a modern novel. Although boredom is quite a modern thing, it started with the kind of industrialization of society. But I didn't see it as a modern novel. I mean, it's pretty much based on Greek myth. Leda and the Swan, for example, is completely embedded in the novel, and it's kind of my kind of returning the image of the myth of Leda and the Swan to its brute materiality, the kind of ugliness of it. We're so used to kind of the Hellenistic reliefs and these beautiful images, but I wanted it to be brutal again. The other thing, I think the reason why people find it a very modern novel is because of there's a kind of, it's not a subplot as such, but there's a sense of urban renewal in the novel and gentrification and the city changing and things being rebuilt. But these are things I didn't think about when I was writing it. These are things that just seem to filter into the novel. I never, from the outset, thought, okay, I really need to reflect, what's going on in society in this area. It just seemed to happen. So it pleases me immensely that people think the Canal is, a modern fiction, even though, its kind of structure is based on Greek myth. I think it's a great sign to how strong Greek myth is, and how important they are.
What I found personally was that the mythic qualities of the Canal, not to sound too grand, but I think it does have them, and the mythic qualities and the contemporary surfaces, they kept undercutting each other in fascinating ways. I was thinking how mythic things were going, in this book, reading it, and then the character would see, for example, a sign on this set of aspirational housing housing developments going up that says, I believe, creating thriving communities, all lowercase, all one word, all Helvetica, and it's very much of our time. And the protagonist sees this sign and these developments with no pleasure, and that I wondered at that point, was this going to be, because I've seen this a lot in recent novels from the UK that I've liked, is this going to be an indictment of what gets called, neoliberal Britain? I don't think it became that, but was there an impulse to write an indictment of neoliberal Britain, or was there an impulse to avoid doing that?
I think, I'm not consciously on my part. I think why those moments are in the novel is because you see that sort of signature up and down the Canal, where these new glass-fronted flats for the kind of young professionals are. But are kind of marginalising the kind of working class in the area who are being kind of pushed out. And I think that personally, I'm very wary of such urban renewal, because I think it completely ignores the culture that already exists in the area. When the protagonist sees that sign, that he sees it purely in its design. He notices the font, he notices the colour of it, and to him, I wanted it to be meaningless. Whereas the kind of the companies and the architects and who are building these properties, they're almost creating their myths. They want people to move into the area and feel like something already exists there. And I wanted to kind of say, well, yes, something already exists in those areas, but it's not what you're creating. You're creating something out of a nothingness, which seems to kind of tie in with the novel. I try to avoid socio-political kind of writing, and I try to avoid critiquing society. I respond to literature purely on theoretical grounds. So there must obviously be something of that in the Canal, because you're not the first to mention these things, but it certainly isn't something that I consciously wrote into the book, and it's something I wasn't really wanting to kind of open into a kind of discourse within the novel either. I think it's just he sees what was happening, and it's reflected back to the reader.
Indeed, and I should clarify, yes, I didn't see a critique of society in the book per se, but what I saw was signposts that pointed toward the possibility that there would be one, but I was relieved that there was not. There was no soapboxing about what has become of Britain, because I've seen that in some novels lately, especially novels that I've enjoyed. Quite frankly, they tend to lean in that direction. But you mention these developments and these developers putting themselves into neighborhoods in ignorance of what's already there, and this is not something that the protagonist ever claims to like, certainly, but he sits down on this canal, and what's already there is also not completely benevolent. I mean, there's these hoods, these teenage hoods he refers to as the pack crew, I believe, and they seem to correct me if I'm wrong, but because I'm American, I don't have great British class radar. These seem to be working class kids, who are the working class element there, and they're worse than anything else in the book. They're the greatest threats to the protagonist's existence, more so than any developer.
Yeah, completely. I'm from a very working class inner city culture. I grew up in inner city Manchester in the north of England, in the north of the town, of the city, which was the more industrialized area. So it stems from a kind of an alienation of place. He's from the same area as those teenagers, yet he doesn't recognize anything in them, and he's fearful of them. And this happens in areas. I go back to where I grew up, and there's gangs of lads on the street corner with nowhere to go. And I used to be one of those gangs of lads who used to hang around there, but now I go back and I'm fearful of them, but I was one of them, and it's this kind of, I'm interested in what happens there, how do you become dislocated from your own place, and your own kind of culture, and how does your own culture not recognize you, and what's going on there. The gang within the Canal, the teen gang, they for me, they're all on a kind of, if I was trying to be very clever and literary, I would say they're my kind of Greek chorus, who kind of, they pop up and just, they tell it as it is, and, this is the violence, we're the violence. Look, reader, this is what's really happening on the Canal. But they're also, I find it very sad that all these teenagers in London and its inner city areas throughout the world, they've got nothing to do. And they're kind of just waiting to be adults. But they don't know what to do with their time, themselves. And and it's, for me, it's quite a sad thing to see. And sometimes I see a gang of inner city lads with their hoods up, and I think they look amazing. They look like this kind of entity walking towards you, with their own language and their different set of rules. And I love that, but I'm immediately fearful of it as well. So I wanted a sense of that in the book. I wanted a sense of this grown man who lived in that area, who's from that area, but is fearful of his own area, his own time, his own roots. And all he has is his memories, that kind of fragment, the kind of narrative. All he can look back on is his memory, because he's displaced. He doesn't feel he belongs.
This quality of youth boredom, I don't want to separate it too far from every other kind of boredom, but it seems like it just transcends time and place and societies. I think of a professor I once had who studied the Soviet Union and visited there in the 70s, and he saw kids with nothing to do, even worse than in the UK today, because in the Soviet Union in the 70s, it was like, well, we'll stand on this corner and chug vodka until we pass out, and it seems like, I think of those two examples of what kids do who are even given less to do by society and who are just as afflicted by boredom and sort of take it out in these ways that can seem bizarre to older people. And I mean, do you consider it all part of the same boredom, or is boredom earlier in life different than boredom later? I mean, you see this character who's older than the teenagers, the protagonist, coming to terms with it in his own way. Is there a function of age here that interacts with this boredom, or is this just...
I think, for me, the boredom is the same. I think everyone, no matter their age, are experiencing the same boredom. I think what's different is the experiences of the passing of time within boredom. I think the group of youths, they don't seem to have this sense of passing of time. Everything is happening now. So they're completely caught within the kind of friction of it, and they're reacting to it now. Whereas he has more of a sense of the passing of time within boredom. He's literally, he's stopping to look and confront boredom. So it's still the same boredom, but I think with age there's there's a certain not appreciation of time, but more of an awareness of the passing of time. So I think that's why he obsesses as much with his fears of the teenagers as he does. There's points where he admires them as well. He admires their kind of naivety. He wants that moment where time isn't a concern. So as much as he's fearful of them, and as much as he's aware that they're as bored as he is, he also kind of admires them as well, even though they're a horrible bunch of kids who are very nefarious and violent.
It makes me think of one example of the protagonist's own young boredom you include toward the end of the book, where he talks about a memory of his brother's Atari Pong type of video game.
Oh, yeah.
He watches the ball, such as it is, make a triangular bounce over and over again between the paddle and one of the walls and something else. And he describes how it isn't boring, and I feel like he didn't even need to insist that it wasn't boring, because I somehow on some level knew that wouldn't be boring, which sounds ridiculous because it's watching a couple of pixels bounce around in a triangle. But yet, is it the element of maybe the hypnotic to it? I mean, is that something that ever entered into your mind as far as what makes the ostensibly boring not boring? Is that hypnotic element to it? Because some books are written that way, to be hypnotic. I don't know whether you thought about that writing the Canal, but what are your thoughts on sort of the way hypnotic things become something other than boring?
I think I was aware of. That's something I wanted to explore. Definitely the hypnotic quality of boredom. And especially within the language and his narration within the Canal, he repeats certain phrases, and he has this very kind of monotone kind of way of expressing things, and that's almost flat but has little blips, and it's and I think that scene, it's towards the end of the book, and it's possibly the most static part of the book, and I love the idea that the book builds up to this moment of pure repetition, and there is that hypnotic quality to it that kind of mollifies us with boredom. Our experience of boredom, we're mollified by it sometimes, as well as frustrated by it. So I wanted this. It's a very integral scene for me because it's a moment of calmness with him and a memory of him and his brother. B, it's the moment where he realizes that that's what he wants. He wants to be caught like everyone else. He's realizing that he can't beat boredom. He can't embrace it. But it's too late for him now because he's stepped outside of it, and he'll always know that everyone else is caught in this repetitive kind of cycle. And the sadness for him is that he stepped out of it and he can't really get back in it unknowingly unless, he was hypnotized, blah, 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 and, he forgets everything. So for me, it's a sadness. He's looking back to a very happy time in his childhood where something happened, he got the computer game to keep repeating and he was happy with the sound of it, the look of it. But now with the passing of time, it signifies so much more to him, which is for him, he wants to be enmeshed. He wants to be caught like everyone else because ultimately he'd be happier. And so, he wants that happiness. It's quite funny. I did a reading up in Manchester about a week ago, and a very astute guy came up to me afterwards in the Q&A, and he says, Lee, your book isn't about boredom, is it? And I says, well, and I was, trying to answer. And he says, it's not about boredom, it's about happiness. And I think he's kind of right. I think, although it's not spoken and he's not a happy character, that one moment where he remembers playing that game with his brother is the one moment he was really, truly happy. And he desires that. And I respond to that when people I've never thought, well, maybe the Canal is about happiness. But, when this reader said this to me at the reading, I just thought, well, yeah, I think possibly, maybe. And, through the hypnotic quality of boredom, he's realized that he doesn't want to embrace boredom, he just wants to be happy, which is quite, saccharine and quite kind of, it's not a happy ending as such, but I like the idea that there's a little bit of happiness in there.
And finally, there's something that I knew I had to ask about when I finished reading this book, which is, I normally don't know what I'm going to ask before an interview, but this is something I had to bring up. Reading this book, reading the hypnotic adventures of this nameless protagonist in a book in our modern world, in this slim book which is not packed with events, which I like about it. There's just as many events as it needs, but they're experienced by this protagonist who is more reactive than active, though he makes a few choice actions. He's very observational, very calm. He operates in many ways according to his own logic. He's an observer of small details, of trash on the road, of signs, of birds going by. But he's also an observer, or, an attempted, perhaps failed commentator on these grand issues of the human condition while he observes these small things. And while he kind of bumbles his way through all this, it leads me to ask you, what is your relationship to the novels of Jean-Philippe Toussaint?
Oh, Toussaint. I read him avidly. He's possibly not ours, but, one of the greatest novelists writing right now. And, he's based on the minutiae. All his writing is about the little things, and the little moments. He's a massive, massive influence. And although he does it like Beckett through a kind of comedy as well, which I try to do but sometimes fail at. And I always admire writers who can, convey deep, deep meaning through a kind of mode of comedy. I think that's an amazing way of expressing, deep sadness, real sadness in existence. And although Toussaint's books are sad, they're funny, and I love that. And again, they're just these little moments, these little insignificant moments that all somehow build up into some kind of whole. So yeah, he's a wonderful writer, wonderful.
And this issue of lightness, to follow up briefly, I was speaking, as you know, with the critic and novelist Gabriel Josipovici on this program not long ago, and we discussed the importance and what he believes to be the critical importance of lightness to works that might be considered experimental or adventurous. And writing something like The Canal, which many people do seem to consider adventurous, I hear the word experimental applied less, but it's the kind of book that accepts sort of whatever labels you want to throw at it and absorbs them, almost rejects them in a certain way. You've kind of answered this with the last response, but I want to know, do you think that writing a book like this, however we want to consider like this, that it is necessary to confront these issues of boredom and what it says about human existence with comedy? I guess lightness is a better way to put it, perhaps, but comedy
lightness
seems more appropriate.
Way of putting it. Josipovici, he's someone I would steer anyone to read. He gets it. The humour in his fictions is spot on. But I've always been, my friends, I forever use this quote by Beckett wherever I go, and if ever Beckett, we're talking about Beckett or what, I always use this quote, and when he said, "Nothing is funnier than unhappiness." And I think that's such a clever way of explaining what he was trying to do, which was this kind of, it's not even irony or anything. It's not, and some would say it's a kind of absurdity, but it's not even that. It's just this kind of devilish kind of humour used to convey heavier things, this lightness and heaviness. I mean, there's a great writer who Lars Eher, his novel Spurious. which is laugh out loud funny, but it's also apocalyptic. It's I always admire that. I can't do that. I'm ill-equipped to be that funny, but that serious at the same time. I kind of ear towards being over-egged seriousness rather than having the confidence to convey it with as much humour as these great writers like Husky Nietzsche does and Lars Eher and Beckett do, and Toussaint does. But these are these are the writers I read. These are the people I want to be like. And there's something about humour. There's just something about it that I love. And I'm not talking about the kind of everyday humour. I'm talking about the humour in the very dark novels that are in existence. And there's just something powerful about humour.
I've been speaking with Lee Rourke, author of The Canal and the short story collection Every Day. Lee, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
If you'd like to learn more about Lee Rourke and The Canal, visit Lee Rourke, LeeRourke.blogspot.com. This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. If you want to hear this show again, or any other interview in the show's history for that matter, visit ColinMarshallRadio.com. That's ColinMarshallRadio.com, or iTunes. Search in the iTunes store for The Marketplace of Ideas. Either way, you'll get the complete archive completely free for the download and the listening wherever and whenever you want to. Questions, comments, feedback, guest suggestions, don't delay. Send them on to Colin at ColinMarshallRadio.com. And as well, there's another website you might want to check out. Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com. Want to get weekly updates straight to your email inbox on current and upcoming Marketplace of Ideas interviews? It's as easy as signing up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Visit ColinMarshallRadio.com, click the Marketplace of Ideas logo, and there on the front page you'll find the very, very oh-so-simple instructions on how to sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. As always, thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next time for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand on the Marketplace of Ideas.